The next thing we want to do today is we're going to take a lot of the same information that we've just talked about, like who's showing up to vote and all that, but we also want to make some predictions based on their past behavior about whether they are more likely to lean liberal or conservative. So here we've got a group, looks like a lot of old people there. They are showing up for a campaign rally, so we know they're likely to participate, but we should be able to make some predictions about them based on their past activity, so we can decide whether or not we think they're going to be more likely to vote for Democrats or Republicans. So we'll start with age because we were just looking at some very excited old people there. We already know this is kind of our most obvious pattern in terms of if they will participate or not. So we know that old people are more likely to participate than young people. And also, based on past behavior, we would predict old people be more likely to be conservative. We would also predict young people would be way more likely to be liberal. This is almost always true in every election, and so we would expect these trends to continue into the future. So old people definitely likely to vote and participate, and they're likely to be conservative. Young people way less likely to vote and participate, but they are likely to lean liberal. One of our biggest factors that helps us separate people today is education. So patterns among college educated people and non-college educated people are becoming the most easy predictors to use about whether or not groups will be liberal or conservative. So, of course, people with college educations, we already looked at that. They are more likely to vote than people that are not college educated. But increasingly, people that are college educated are way more likely to lean liberal, and people that lack college educations are way more likely to lean conservative. This is based on turnout and patterns in our recent elections, and these are trends we expect to continue into the future. When we look at income, we see a different pattern. And it's important to understand that when we're talking about these variables, when we're talking about these different demographic characteristics, it's important that we treat each one of them individually, because here we see that lower income voters are less likely to vote. But they are more likely to be liberal. We see that higher income voters are more likely to vote, but they are likely to be conservative. And this is true. These patterns are also true. But we are probably thinking that there's probably a lot of overlap in education, higher education, and higher income. So obviously, each voter is a complex person with all sorts of different priorities when they go and vote. But one of our best predictors lately has become education. One of our best predictors historically has been income. We also broke down racial groups a little earlier. We know that white people historically are more likely to participate, and minority groups historically are less likely to participate. We also saw that in 2008 and 2012, African American voters actually had the highest turnout percentage of any racial demographic group. And so that is really important because that will have huge implications for future campaigns. The campaigns that followed those two elections in 2016 and 2020 had way more specific goals to reach out to African American voters than the campaigns before that had. So that's very, very important and a changing pattern that we're seeing. But historically, we would stick with the fact that white people are more likely to show up and vote. But it is important for us to remember that white people overall are more likely to be conservative, and minority groups overall are more likely to be liberal. Now, these patterns may change and are changing a little bit, but these are the historical patterns. So if we were approached with a question on an AP exam or something like that, these would be the answers we would want to give. We also break people down by gender, and we see some same patterns that we saw earlier. We saw that women are a little more likely to participate than men. They participate at higher rates in voting than men do. So women are a little more likely to participate than men. Also, women are more likely to be liberal, and men are more likely to be conservative. We call this the gender gap. You guys probably remember that term from way back, but the gender gap explains, the gender gap describes the tendency for women in America to be more liberal and to be more likely to vote Democratic than men. So gender breakdowns are pretty consistent patterns that we see from election to election. Religion is another really important predictor among demographics. So, if we just take people who call themselves religious and people who would consider themselves more secular, religious groups are more likely to participate. Places of worship tend to be like great organizing groups. They may just help like remind people when elections take place. They may encourage people to vote a certain way. And people that are more secular, people that don't have regular organized religion as a consistent part of their life, they're less likely to get those reminders and those group pressures to participate. So there's slightly less participation among secular Americans. Religious Americans are more likely they're usually more likely to consider themselves conservative, and secular Americans are more likely to lean liberal. To take a little closer look at religious groups, these are just a couple of religious groups that are mentioned specifically in our book, and they want us to know these patterns here. And again, these are just the patterns among the groups. But when we think of Catholic voters as a religious group, they do have very strong religious beliefs, but they have historically been loyal to the Democratic Party. For a long time, there has been a lot of party loyalty among Catholics to the Democrats specifically. JFK was the only Catholic president that we've ever had until Joe Biden. So now there have been two Catholic presidents that are both Democrat, and that had created some strong bonds of party loyalty. If it didn't exactly translate into ideological consistency, but they have been very loyal to Democrats, and so that's a pattern that we want to remember. Jewish voters, very religious group, tend to be very, very liberal. That is a very strong predictor of how they will vote. So overall, most Jewish people tend to be liberal ideologically, and people who identify themselves as evangelical Protestants tend to be the group that is the strongest base for conservatives. So they tend to be overwhelmingly conservative and a strong center of votes for campaigns appealing to conservatives. We'll kind of break down people by the type of job they do. This obviously doesn't include everyone, but just a couple of important groups that get some attention in voting patterns here. So, business owners, especially small business owners, they are very likely to participate. They have a lot at stake. They've got a lot of policy preferences and things like that, but they tend to be conservative. Small business owners tend to be more conservative, and that's because the government would get out of their way and allow them to run their business however they want. Labor unions, another group that's very likely to participate. If a worker belongs to a labor union, they are likely to be very highly organized. They're likely to have a lot of stakes in the election, and they're very likely to encourage each other to participate together. Labor unions tend to be very, very liberal. So when we're talking about groups of organized workers, those groups tend to be liberal. They have traditionally been big time sources of voters, but especially of campaign contributions for Democrats in particular. So labor unions have a long history of being associated with the Democrats. The last thing we'll look at is regional. So when we think about regionally, just real simply, if we look at urban and rural, it's easy to understand that rural voters are less likely to participate, especially if we think about participation extending beyond voting. So think about other ways people participate. If it's joining interest groups or going to political party meetings, going to town halls, going to, participating in protests or demonstrations and marches, those things are just all way less likely to occur in rural areas. So there's not nearly as many opportunities to participate in rural areas. And so rural voters and citizens are likely to participate less. They are very likely to lean conservative. So our rural areas are going to be strong bases of conservative support. Urban citizens and urban voters are more likely to participate, have more opportunities to participate. There's obviously voting, but there's participating in marches, demonstrations, all those kinds of things, joining political parties, going to town hall meetings, all that kind of stuff. Our urban areas are going to be very liberal. So most urban centers in the United States are strong bases of support for liberals. And when we take a look regionally, a little more detailed here, this is more important for us to pay attention to the ideology. East Coast, West Coast, Midwestern voters, their voter participation is all about the same. Our textbook stuff does tend to make the point that voter turnout historically has been lower in southern states. So states in the South do have less turnout typically than those states on the East Coast, West Coast, or states in the Midwest. But pay attention to their ideological leanings here. The East Coast and West Coast, our coast, tend to be very liberal. So we tend to have very strong liberal support on the coast, on the East Coast and on the West Coast. The Midwest has been a source of conservative support, and so has the South. So that's an important thing for us to pay attention to, and something that we see a lot when we look at maps that summarize the results of presidential elections. And while we're talking about voters, let's take a look at our friend President Trump voting. He seems surprised here, don't know what's going on, but he's casting his vote in the 2020 election, hopefully voting for himself. Today, as we think about voters, it's important that we are able to explain the reasons why voters choose to participate. So think about, policy voting, partisan voting, candidate evaluation, pocketbook voting, those kinds of things. Also, it's important for us to remember the reasons why people don't participate. We need to be able to compare demographic groups to find voter turnout patterns. So we need to be able to break down all sorts of different demographics of the voters and be able to make some predictions about which groups of people are more likely to participate than others. It's also important for us to be able to identify the groups of people who are likely to be liberal and to identify the groups of people who are likely to be conservative. It is pretty common for the AP test to give us a multiple choice question where it's a bunch of different hypothetical people that'll give us all sorts of demographic characteristics and have us predict whether they are more likely to be a Democrat or a Republican. So lots of stuff to pay attention to today as we think about voters. All right, that's it for voters. We've talked a lot about voters, who they are, and why they act the way they act. But now let's take a look at the policies that impact voters. So we'll be shifting over to look a little more at the laws about how people vote.